The Man in the High Castle is a book written by Philip K. Dick. I have to admit, I have not read the book. I have watched at least the first two seasons of the series, if not a little bit more. Uh, I find the show highly enjoyable. Very interesting concept. The writers did a pretty good job of taking this whole thing, and I thought the cultural aspects of it really handled well. It makes a very interesting story. But the question comes, and is actually a very important question: how possible could that outcome have been? The idea of Japan and Germany actually being able to take down large portions of the world, including each of them taking roughly a third of the United States. And there's actually historical import to that because the reality of that plays into a lot of people's mindset about how World War II played out, uh, justifications for how things played out after the war, and continuing justifications for foreign intervention around the world. So let's look at it realistically. Now, if we take a look at Japan, by the time we get to the point where the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor, we have to understand the position Japan itself is in. Japan had been cut off from oil supplies from the United States, cut off from steel. And so, for the most part, they were operating off reserves at that point. They had limited sources to bring in because they didn't have, even when they were capturing areas that were rich in these materials, they didn't have the workforce to extract it in a meaningful way. So, what did the Japanese actually intend to happen due to their attack on Pearl Harbor? And this is something that's really important to understand because it's different than what a lot of people assume. Essentially, the Japanese understood that they, country to country, had no ability to actually defeat the United States of America. Uh, they understood our industrial output. They understood the fact that we had uh, much greater access to resources than they ever could imagine, and we had a much larger population. So there never was a goal of invading mainland America. Uh, and initially, there was no intent to invade Hawaii. Later on, they threw that out as a possibility, but they never really got too close in that decision making process. Based on what the Japanese knew about their capabilities versus ours, their goal was to hit Pearl Harbor, destroy sufficient amounts of our fleet so that we would be essentially incapable of interfering with them for 18 to 24 months. So they actually had no particular hope defeating us. They hoped the sneak attack would shut us down briefly so that they could continue their invasion of Indonesia, which has oil resources, and invading French Indochina, which would have given them access to rubber and a few other things that would have made the war effort easier on them. They hoped that at the end of this 18 to 24 months that they would be so deeply entrenched in all these places that uh, they would be able to fight the United States to a standstill, and that they would be basically wear the United States out, and the United States would say, "Well, we can't keep this war up. It's not worth fighting. We'll come to some negotiated truce or peace, or however they came up with it." Now, going beyond the resources and the population issue, there's actually further problems that are going on with the Japanese. the Japanese were occupying Korea and Manchuria. And in their attempt to lock down some of the land areas around Manchuria that were in dispute with Russia, they actually ended up in a shooting war with Russia briefly. Uh, the Japanese basically got their clocks cleaned. And because the Russians had uh, more important things to look at in Europe than they did in Asia, they were willing to come to essentially a non aggression pact with the Japanese. However, the Japanese had to take seriously the potential for the Russians to come back at them, so they had to maintain the frontier between them and the Russians. The other problem was is the Japanese army was deeply engaged in China, bogged down, in fact. Uh, so they were in a situation where they were actually depleting the munitions and resources of the Japanese production. And that's one of the reasons why they felt it so imperative to seize the oil and rubber from Indonesia and French Indochina. They did have some iron and coal being extracted from Korea and to a lesser extent Manchuria and Manchukuo, which is kind of a counterpart of Manchuria. So the Japanese were very overstretched at this point. Uh, their resources were low, and their best hope, the most they thought they could get out of this, was an 18 to 24-month delay by taking out our Pacific Fleet. So if everything had gone, and there's actually one of the ways they could have gotten exactly what they were looking for is if they had bombed the fuel depot at Ford Island and Hawaii, which they did not. That would have actually forced the Pacific Fleet to relocate back to San Francisco. So the Japanese never even hoped to get that far because even if they had thrown every resource they had into it, if they would pulled their army out of China and directed it at the United States, they still wouldn't have had the resources in order to mount any kind of invasion. And even if they did, they would rapidly have run out of the materials to maintain an army. Any kind of toehold they would have gotten on the U.S. mainland would have been short-lived and tenuous. So the idea of the Japanese being able to occupy the West Coast is farcical at best. So looking over at the German side, could the Germans have pulled something off? Um, and it's one of those really difficult things because I mean, if you talk to any of the Veraboos out there, that's a joking term for essentially fanboys of the German military during that time period. Uh, there's this tendency to sit there and say, "Well, look, if Germany had just done this differently, things would have gone positive. And if that other thing they did wrong, and that other thing they did wrong, and that other thing they did wrong." The thing is, the Germans made lots of mistakes, and in addition to making lots of mistakes, they were really stretched thin in their ability to pull off what they were trying to do. And part of it is understanding what uh, what Hitler had in mind for the invasion of Russia, because uh, in Mein Kampf he was very much adamant that the goal always was to head east, always. So any of the other detours that occurred, the invasion of France, the air war with UK, uh, were just that, diversions. They weren't things that the Germans had planned, nor did they actually really want to do. Uh, what they wanted in the East is they wanted Ukraine. They wanted Ukraine so that they could have the breadbasket of Europe. They also wanted the Caucasus so that they could have access to the Russian oil. Uh, it's a fairly complicated thing to get into German socialist economic theory and their idea of autarky and all the other things they were dealing with. But to understand, they already knew that once they were in a war, they would become very short of food and very short of oil. So that's why they had the goal of taking Ukraine and Caucasus away from Russia, because their goal was to get hold of these resources so that they could continue their war. In fact, there were many points in the war where a lack of food and a lack of oil pretty much came close to grinding things to a halt. Uh, there's a lot of misunderstanding about the prowess of the German army. Uh, One of the things they had a huge advantage on is they had been developing a lot of items clandestinely with the Russians, and they also have been developing things clandestinely in the homeland. When they went up against Poland, Poland wasn't nearly as good a military as the rest of Europe thought it was. And when the Germans came rolling through, the reason they were able to do it so quickly is they did have superior arms. They did have more or less superior manpower. They had potential reserves beyond what the Polish did. And Poland as a country, as it was oriented towards Germany, had virtually no geographical boundaries that could slow the Germans down. So once the Polish were in a position of being rolled back, they didn't have much in the way of places where they would be able to stop the advance. And of course, then once the Russians come in from the other side, doesn't really make a difference if the Polish even would have been able to slow the Germans down. Now, the key thing to understand in terms of the German Navy is the Germans had uh, if you compared it to the entire British fleet, incredibly inferior. And even if you compared it to the Atlantic fleet of the Brits, it still had nothing even close in terms of matching it. They did have some success with their U boats, but at best, what they were doing was making things harder for the British, but not necessarily shutting them down. Some people say, well, yeah, there were some points where it got really close. Yeah, but the Germans were completely at the end of their ropes when they were doing that. They didn't have an extra special strategy. If they would have just done things a little differently, that would have pushed them over the edge. Maybe some luck, but it really wasn't going to happen that way because the United States, even before we were involved in the war, weren't going to let Britain go down. So even in the best situation, we're looking at a German Navy that could not force its way across the English Channel. Uh, they did not have landing craft. Their idea of an invasion their idea was essentially to use barges to carry the heavy equipment over, seize a port, and then force their way inland from there. So that would have required knocking out the English Navy and the Royal Air Force, and I don't see that as being very likely. There's a great to do made about uh, the Battle of Britain and the air war over it. But in fact, the Germans' strategy was hideous from the get go. That's even before they switched to bombing cities. The likelihood of them being able to sweep the RAF from the sky was pretty low. And even if they had succeeded it wouldn't make crossing the English Channel a shoe in by any stretch. But let's imagine for a second that the Germans actually somehow pulled it off and crossed the English Channel and somehow were able to defeat the British on their home islands. Well, that doesn't suddenly make the British Empire go away. The empire was all across the planet. What would have happened is the uh, remnants of the RAF, the almost wholly intact British Navy and the British government would have set up government shops someplace else, probably Canada, where they could direct the war from there. So the Germans would have ended up bogged down uh, with a huge occupation that would have actually taken resources away from their ability to fight the Russians, which they needed desperately over there once they opted to go in that direction. Uh, so the defeat of the British islands would have been minor in terms of affecting the outcome of the British Empire in the World War II, and the likelihood of them pulling it off was very unlikely, very low, very improbable. They just did not have the resources to pull it off, and that's why ultimately they didn't even try. Yeah, the Luftwaffe RAF battle over Britain, the Germans were, even though they had initially a numerical advantage, they had a huge disadvantage in that their planes were always at the end of their fuel tanks, and the British were always at essentially had plenty of fuel because they were taking off and defending close, whereas the Germans were flying long distance to get there. So the time over target that the Germans were able to achieve versus the British ability to maintain their time over target could never be altered more favorably to the German side, at least with the particular fight they were having. Um, I've seen some interesting ideas where if the Germans had essentially marshaled their entire air force and used it solely for the purpose of protecting an invasion fleet and essentially met the RAF in one single point over a port that the Germans were contesting from the Brits, that would have given them their absolute best chance. One, because it would have put the German Air Force at the shortest distance flying that it could, where it wouldn't have to worry about engaging all of England. It would be basically fighting over one point. It would have saved a lot of fuel. They would have had more time over target than they would have at any other point fighting over England. And even with that, 2020 hindsight, looking at that as a potential solution, that's a coin toss at best in terms of victory. And even if they would have seized a port, it would not have guaranteed that they would have been able to break out and push their way across England. So the outcome of Operation Sea Lion, basically petering out and going to nothing, was pretty close to an inevitability. And if they had actually tried pushing their way across the channel, they probably would have been in worse shape to deal with the Russians once they went up against them. So let's talk about going up against the Russians. Well, the biggest myth that a lot of people have about the German army was they look at it as this mechanized giant, when in fact, uh, the number of tanks they had were never huge. They were actually, when they went into France, they were outnumbered tank wise. The French had actually diminished their numbers by poor implementation and tactics. Whereas when they went up against the Soviets, the numbers were horribly outmatched in terms of the Germans. Now, initially, the Germans looked good on paper because the Russians had uh, built a lot of very light tanks because of the particular tactics they believed they were going to be using in war. And these light tanks were no match for German medium tanks. So initially, it looks really disproportionate, like the Russians are really getting beat. But in fact, uh, the tank war was not coming out in favor of the Germans as much as they would like. The German infantry was 10% mechanized. The remainder was on foot and horseback. And this always caused a huge problem because even when the Germans could break through and surround the Russians with their armor and with their mechanized, a lot of times, a lot of the Russians would just get out of the pocket before the infantry could catch up. The Germans were running a combination of numerous different equipment. They were running captured French equipment. They were running German equipment. They were running Polish equipment. They were running Czechoslovakian equipment. And this caused them a lot of problems in terms of upkeep because they all needed different parts. The trek into Russia degraded the German tanks massively, even though on paper they seemed like they were inflicting huge losses on the Russians. At the same time, mechanical breakdowns were taking a toll on their ability to move forward. They were at points when they were down to 25% effective in terms of keeping their tanks running because they were outrunning their supply lines. They didn't have the parts to repair things that broke down. A lot of times they ended up cannibalizing uh, one broken tank to try to keep the other tanks running. Uh, so, although the initial thrust into Russia looks very impressive, one of the huge advantages they had going in, obviously, was that their troops were experienced, the Russian troops not so experienced. And essentially, as this experience level, as the Russian experience level went up, their ability to hold against the Germans more and more and more as the war went on became obvious. And in the end, German resources couldn't match Russian resources. And you eventually end up having the Germans getting pushed back. So, are there scenarios where the Germans could have potentially beat the Russians? Uh, Potentially, but they're fairly slim. One of the big problems Hitler had was that he had General Halder on his side. uh, Halder did not believe in uh, Hitler's economic theories, and so he did a lot to actually undermine the initial grand strategic plan Hitler had in mind in terms of seizing Ukraine and Caucasus. He wanted to seize Moscow. And there's a lot of questions as to whether seizing Moscow would have shut the Russians down or not. Uh, but in the end, let's say for fun that the Germans did everything absolutely right. You go back and let's say you're a time traveler and you go back and you have the big book of everything that happened in the war and you're able to talk the Germans into becoming part of the OKH, and you go through and go, yeah, here we do this, here we do this, here we do this. At the absolute best, if the Germans could have pulled it off somehow, they would have been sitting along the edge of the Ural Mountains, occupying most of the industrial part of Russia. They would not have been able to defeat the interior of Russia. They would have been bogged down for decades trying to occupy and tame this area because it was vast. It swallowed up the German manpower, and it would have been a long time before they would have been able to start really pulling the resources out of it to make any good of it. So even if they had beat the Russians, their ability to turn around and come back after the United States isn't terribly likely. Because the same tiny navy they had that couldn't defeat the British Navy is the same tiny navy they'd be trying to use to defeat the uh, British Navy and the United States Navy. So you don't, you're not going to get much out of that. But the problem is the likelihood of them being able to beat Russia was very low. They'd completely overextended themselves by the time they got done with the first 6 months of battle there. And their ability to make gains was going to be painful at that point. Now, one of the things that could have altered events, that could have maybe put Germany occupying large chunks of the former Soviet Union, but kind of in a stalemate out there, is if the United States hadn't done Lend Lease. The Russians like to downplay the impact of Lend Lease, but Lend Lease was huge. Uh, as one person put it, uh, the Russian troops marched to Berlin in American trucks and American boots. So without the Lend Lease, uh, the Germans could have potentially occupied good chunks of Eastern Europe, possibly even pushing to the Urals, but they still would have been in the exact same position they were before. They would have had to occupy it. They would have had to bring it under control, and then they would have had to exploit it for the resources in order to build up anything even remotely big enough to go contest against the British Navy, the United States Navy, and then try to land. Okay, so one of the things, so let's say for some reason, uh, both Japan and Germany did the absolute best they possibly could. Could they have combined forces for an eastern and western attack against the United States? And the answer is no. It's really far fetched. I mean, the United States Navy was sufficient enough to take on the Japanese Navy on its own, and that was only a part of it. Whereas the bulk of the U.S. Navy was in the Atlantic. So even if they'd somehow been able to pull off everything, not likely. Now, one of the things they throw in, it's a major element of the show, is the German nuclear program. And that's always been a bugaboo, if I'm using the term right. Just, it's something that's not, it wasn't going to happen. One of the things that when Germany fell and they were able to start looking at their documents and put everything together, the answer to what was going on with their nuclear program was they weren't even close. They didn't have the resources, they didn't have the manpower to put into it. I mean, they made some impressive gains with what they had, uh, but the likelihood of them building a nuclear bomb before the United States was very unlikely. The likelihood of even them being able to build a bomb if they gain some kind of victory in Europe, probably by the 50s at the absolute earliest, they would probably be able to put something like that together. And that would assume that they got off of a wartime footing and were able to go to peace and sink a large chunk of their economy into building a bomb. A lot of people don't understand the reason why the United States was able to build a nuclear bomb for everybody else is because we literally grabbed up scientists from all over the planet and put them all in one spot. Uh, no one ever did anything like that uh, before or since. So it was a unique situation where everybody who knew something about nuclear power, except for the Germans, were essentially sitting in the United States building a bomb for us. Whereas the Germans stuck with what was left over there, the people who didn't flee, and they were never going to have the resources. The amount of money the United States put into building the bomb was out of reach of the Germans. Uh, they would have had to strip resources from other endeavors in order to build a bomb. And stripping resources from anything would have caused a front to collapse and would have just ended the war more quickly for them. So, although I find the series very enjoyable because I think the writers were very clever in how they created their Japanese occupied America and their German occupied America, I don't think it's very likely that they could have ever came even close to pulling something off like that. Now, why is this important historically? Well, because a lot of people base things in terms of, well, we were in grave danger. We could have been invaded. There could have been Germans goose stepping through Times Square. Not really, no. And our leadership was well aware of that. If we'll definitely get into what happened in the Pacific at some point in the future, but essentially, our leadership wanted in that war desperately. And as um, cavalier as they are with American lives, I know they weren't crazy enough to do something that would destroy the country. So if they maneuvered us into a war, they well knew that the likelihood of it actually reaching the shores of the United States were very, very remote, and that essentially the war would be happening far across the world where the homeland didn't have to fear. So, hope you enjoyed that. If you liked the video, please like it. If you have comments on it, please bring up comments. Sometimes I make videos based on, I will answer your comments, but I also sometimes make videos based off your comments. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. And if you think you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. All right, thank you for spending time with me. I hope to see you again in a future video.